podcast. I'm your host, Mike Klein. In this series, we're going to meet some of the world's comms disruptors. These are people working in and around communication who are really changing the game, challenging old assumptions, acting on new ideas, and demonstrating a willingness to share those ideas. Today's guest is no exception, Monique Zytnik. Monique Zytnik is an award-winning global internal communication leader based in Berlin, Germany. She's worked internationally, presented on best practice communication at world conferences, and guest lectured at universities. Her campaigns have been recognized by Gartner, Mumbrella CommsCon, and the Digital Communication Awards. She regularly shares her knowledge through communication industry publications and podcasts, drawing on her in-house and consultancy work with organizations including eBay, DHL Group, SBS Radio Australia, and the Lego Foundation. Monique is the author of Internal Communication in the Age of Artificial Intelligence, published by Business Expert Press on 30 May 2024. Welcome, Monique Zytnik.
Thank you so much, Mike, and thank you to all of your viewers and listeners on your podcast. It's such an exciting thing for you to be sharing all of this knowledge and all of this experience with the world.
Glad to do it and glad to have you here. As I mentioned before, you are a very recent author, having recently authored your take on internal communication, particularly as artificial intelligence becomes an issue and an opportunity in organizations and communities. And having read your book a few weeks ago, I noticed that there are a number of concurrent themes, things running alongside each other in your book. You've got content versus strategy, you've got the roles of leaders and communicators, and you've got how AI changes the game. Why did you focus on all three of these concurrently, and why are they intertwined?
Well, Mike, firstly, I love the fact that you've picked up on these different themes and elements because it is complex. The environment that we are in at the moment is complex, and life is complex, people are complex, and work is complex. And that's why these three key themes are entwined. So, first and foremost, the environment that the book is placed in is now. We're at the start of the fourth industrial revolution, which is changing the way that we manufacture and the way that we do business. And it's characterized by artificial intelligence, the metaverse, and blockchain, to name a few different technologies. And it is really changing the game and the way that we are playing. So this is the environment that we're in. We're in the age of artificial intelligence. And this means that we need to double down on strategy. And there are a number of reasons for that. And one of the reasons is that up until now, we've been very much focused on content marketing, pushing out content. But content is king in the internet era. In the age that Bill Gates said content is king, start of the internet. That's many, many years ago. Now we need to shift to being much more strategic because there is so much noise. And it's not just me who's seeing this, Mike. For example, one of my favorite all-time authors and thought leaders, aside from yourself and a couple of other internal comms and comms professionals, one of my favorite thought leaders is Seth Godin, and he's currently writing a book on strategy, everyday strategy for people going across life, work, how to be more deliberate in the decisions and the way that you do things. So I can't wait for his book that's coming out towards the end of October. But again, strategy is where we need to be to get results.
By strategy, it's there's a lot of people talking about strategy in the internal comm space today. In fact, Rachel Miller wrote a book recently about essentially creating internal comms strategies. But do you see a distinction between a strategy and strategy more generally?
To me, strategy means knowing where you are, so where you are and where you want to get to, and working out how you're going to get there in a deliberate way with specific steps, checking as you go each moment, each milestone of the way. So in sort of an agile type approach. And it's no different with business strategy as to comms strategy. It's all about being clear on where you want to get to, thinking it out, having your research there, basing your decisions on research, the best possible information that you have at hand, and then making sure that you've got your stakeholders and people on board, and then you're delivering and actually actioning the strategy. And this is where I have so many moments of frustration, is when people create these strategies and they have them on paper and everybody agrees and it's great, and then nothing happens. And it doesn't matter how you come to the strategy as long as it's based on best practice. And Rachel has a really great methodology for that as well. You can incorporate things as well, like design thinking principles. You can, if you look at the way that as a physiotherapist we used to create our
You
strategies,
used to be a physiotherapist, correct?
That's right, Mike. Once upon a time, I was a physiotherapist. So that's where I learnt scientific research. That's where I learnt how to create simple strategies. So based on subjective, like what you were seeing, objective, what you were measuring, action, which is what you decide would be the best results, and then your plan on how you're going to get to that, and then evaluating as you go. So that's a super simple way to come to a strategy, but there are many, many different ways that you can create your strategy. The most important thing is that it's robust and that you do something with it and you evaluate.
Let me jump back to something you just put into one of these to the answer that you were generating, which was that strategies should follow best practice. Joanna Parsons has spent a fair amount of time over the last few months challenging the idea of best practice as a foundation for, pretty much anything in the internal comm space. And I'm actually inclined to agree with her, to the extent that internal comms has become, internal communicators are perhaps a bit unduly conservative about what they're proposing. Why did you say best practice, and why do you think best practice is a foundation for strategy?
Again, Mark, I think this comes back to definitions, and I'm sure if we picked it apart, you and I and Joanna would be in furious agreement. But my view for best practice is you need to have a basis or a starting point. You can't go on just random gut feeling. You need to have an understanding of what you're trying to achieve, of what people have done before you and what may or may not work. Each situation, each target audience that you're trying to communicate with, each organization is different. And that's where you take these, and I call them best practice, but they're really principles, and apply the principles and tweak and adapt as you go. So it's not like, okay, let's take this cookie cutter. Let's take this cookie cutter and apply it to everything. That's absolutely the wrong approach. What I'm saying is we need to have a starting point. We need to understand the principles, and we need to apply and adapt as we go, constantly evaluating. And I can link this directly back to my experience as a physiotherapist, where you would base your decisions on best practice knowledge at the time, what the science said was correct, and then adapt your plan or your approach depending on what the patient was like, what their living situation was like, what the goals or what they were actually trying to achieve. So if you ignore science, if you ignore research, then you're just pulling stuff out of the air, is my view. And as I said, I'm sure that this is coming down to differences in definitions of the word of best practice or how we're approaching the problem.
Okay, I mean that's that's reasonable, at least from the standpoint of this conversation. Um, there's a running theme in the conversation among internal comms people, be they leaders, managers, consultants, what have you, about the level of interest that leaders should have. There's a lot of talk that's saying leaders should pay attention to internal communication. They must follow these principles. They need to have this support. But it seems the exception when leaders actually embrace internal comms and get things right from our perspective. Is that a fair assessment? And if so, why or why not?
Well, Mike, the latest Institute of Internal Comms research does show that 49% of internal communication practitioners do agree that their leaders are effective at communicating with employees, which means 51% think that they're not. So I would say your assessment is a fair assessment. And the challenge in speaking to a lot of leaders, not only for my book, but through my experience is, and through the stories from other practitioners, is that there's one-to-one communication, which is that interpersonal communication. There are the books that you will see in the airport bookstore. And then there's the one to your team communication, which you might see some of those how to manage your team. Quite often, dare I say, LinkedIn confuses internal comms with this kind of team communication. And leaders are quite often very, very good at that. But that one to many, when you're communicating at scale, so I'm talking about more than 50 people in an effective way, that requires an understanding of the strategy. And a lot of leaders haven't been taught or informed or educated, I don't know how to put it, how this differs from the interpersonal communication or that team communication, about the need to plan and not necessarily go on gut feeling anymore, and the need to adapt, and the need to have these other elements to the strategy where you're building and changing your approach depending on what's coming back. So I think that's where the challenge is, that they haven't been educated.
So basically, what you're saying is that most leaders, when it comes to one-to-many communication, have a step to take that they haven't gone through, be it because they haven't figured it out for themselves or they're not using their internal comm support appropriately in terms of communicating at scale and in terms of having either a consistent approach or at least a rigorous approach to doing so. Is that basically what you're saying?
I think it comes from both sides, Mike. It comes from the side of the leader where they simply haven't had the opportunity to learn. Maybe they haven't been put through training. A lot of leaders recognize there's an issue there, but they simply don't have or make the time to be upskilled in this area because they're busy doing other things. And then there's the communication leaders or us as practitioners, where we might not have tried to present the information in a way that is understandable. And if we go to the IABC World Conference, Oscar Mundos gave a great example of how he was sitting with his C-suite when the comms person came into the room and said things are lighting up on Twitter about a issue with a passenger, and these leaders didn't understand what that meant. And Oscar was saying that the comms professional assumed that they understood the significance of this. So there's a dialogue always has more than one person, and I think we need to be in dialogue with our leaders about how to communicate effectively with our people at scale.
This brings up a couple of points. You talk about leaders being busy doing other things. You talk about internal communicators not having the ability to convey what's important to them in a way that resonates with leaders. One of the things that I've noticed, I've spent a fair amount of time talking with leaders, and particularly I was at a reunion at my business school. I went to London Business School some years ago and talked to a fair number of people who were senior corporate types. And it's not, from what I understand, it's not just simply that they have other things to do. It's that on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is getting the exit strategy sorted out, getting to a point where the organization is firing, not firing. It's operationally sound. They see internal communication as a nice to have. What's missing for internal communication leaders, internal communication folk, to get that conversation further up the scale? Or do we just simply have to accept that and find other ways to work with them?
I think as a communicator, Mike, we have an amazing toolbox of persuasion and influencing skills. And we need to almost turn it to our own profession and being able to explain the value that we offer a leader. And a part of that is the usual about sort of building trust and quick wins and earning a seat at the table. You've got to have something valuable to say. But there are other elements there where we need to have business acumen, and we need to be able to explain things in a way that makes sense for our leaders. So drawing those clear lines between what we're doing and business success and business outcomes. And it's actually a little bit tragic that only in the past few years there's been that recognition that by activating our employees, we can actually activate our community more broadly, who we're trying to influence. So our employees can be our biggest advocates if we harness, obviously we need to be in a good relationship with them, but if we harness their motivation, if we harness their connections, if we harness their voice, we can achieve so much more than just through a central business channel. And it's bringing this to forefront and having, as I said, I come from a physio background, having the scientific proof, having the research, the numbers to show that this is in fact the case. And technology nowadays does make that much easier to prove.
Well, it's interesting that you mention technology in this context, because you position your book as internal communication in the age of artificial intelligence. And what I found interesting about your book is that the strategy and the execution stuff isn't that much different from internal comms books that have been written 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Because actually, with the exception of a lot of the technology stuff, the fundamental dynamics remain roughly the same. You've got communicating at scale, you've got the role of leaders, you've got the role of employees. Technology enables things. But on the other hand, you mentioned that there are about 6,000 comms-aligned AI tools out there. And that's not even all the other technology tools that aren't necessarily AI native, if you will. How can we possibly navigate this landscape in any kind of coherent or effective way?
Can I just pause there, Mike, because my book does talk about immersive communication, which is another level that we need on top of the existing communication strategies. And that's the key point that we as communication professionals can take heart in at the moment in this time of technology change. That our understanding of, and I come back to best practice, I'm sorry, but our understanding of what good is, we don't need to throw out of the window. We've got that basis. We just need those extra couple of model, like components to the model on top.
What do you mean by immersive communication? That term might not be familiar to everybody who's listening.
Sure. So immersive communication. So at the foundation, we have the sender receiver, which is David Berlow's model that everybody will be familiar with. Some people say push pull, which I don't like, but that's basically I send you a message and you send something back. Then we have the networks and the community, which is where we work with networks to have that cross silo effect. And then at the top is the immersive. And immersive communication is enabled more easily by new technology. It's where you put the audience in the center of the experience. It's not about the sender sending something. It's about the audience receiving in the way that in their preferred way. And it is multisensory, it is non-linear, and it is gamified and interactive. And I know that we use a lot of these elements in comms already. We're not so great at the non-linear, but it's about putting it together in a deliberate way and understanding how it works more effectively.
So, you also talked about immersive communication not necessarily requiring a massive amount of technology. And I kind of head back to the simulation games that we played in, at university and at graduate school, where you create a scenario and people have roles and you act out the scenario. Would that be something you'd consider immersive as well?
The gamified element definitely, but even if we look at, say, a poll on LinkedIn, that is more interactive than just reading an article. It's about someone providing input or doing something and being an active part of your communication. And that's the interactivity or the gamifications, obviously, where you put points and the rest. As I've mentioned in my book, and some people might know, I do have children, and it's taken me a long time to admit that publicly. That's a whole other story that we can talk about some other time, Mike. But just sitting with my son the other day, and we were trying to search for Lego pieces. And one was building, and we were doing the searching for the specific Lego pieces. My son, who was doing the building and requesting the Lego pieces, was actually giving us points. Oh, Mummy, you've got 2 points because you were the quickest. And then we would get a reward. And once we'd accumulated a certain amount of points, I didn't prompt him on this, but this is the way that the younger generation are thinking, because this is the way that the computer games, the way that they learn at school, all of that, it operates. And this is what the future generation will be expecting in our workforce as well. So our Lego game didn't require any technology, but it was certainly gamified.
No, fair enough. And that actually highlights an issue that's kind of on the edge of a lot of what we're dealing with at the moment, which is that younger employees tend to be much more, they tend to have a much higher appetite for feedback. And it sounds like this approach actually builds some feedback loops into it that can sustain the interest of people in internal communication. So, I definitely see that could, shift the dynamic to a certain extent. But I wanted to get back to the question about navigating the technology landscape. You mentioned, you were writing this actually kind of mid to late last year, correct? I recall.
So I started end of 2020, November 22.
So when you came up with this 6,000 figure, chances are we probably have significantly more than 6,000 of these tools today.
Absolutely. And that was the CIPR research that was done at this, I think, February 2023. So that's some time ago. And we would have thousands and thousands more now out there and more every day.
So how do we navigate this landscape? What do you think we should watch out for? What, where do you think we should go to get some guidance about all of this stuff that's out there? Because, I don't think there are that many I see folks who've got the time or bandwidth to experiment with even 10% of this total.
Absolutely. With everything, technology merely enables. So it's about being clear on what you want it for. So before you go out for a search on some sort of new shiny AI component to whatever you're using, you just need to be really clear on where you need help. What's the problem that you're trying to solve? It's no different from any other problem solving. And then once you've got a clear specification or idea of what that is, and it could be that you're sick of writing notes for meetings when you're trying to concentrate on the meetings. Once you're clear on what that is, then there are organisations that have already got rules in place as to what employees can and can't use. So some people are already restricted in that sense. But then it's about working out what makes sense. And I would definitely do a quick check with colleagues or friends as to what they've found useful. So yeah, I mean, it's obviously also dependent on whether you're a Microsoft or a Google based organization, or you're sitting with a different type of tech stack, because everything does need to integrate. And yeah, and seeing what you might already have, because a lot of people are surprised to find out that there is a audio to text functionality in Microsoft Word, which is super easy to use, and it's AI powered, and you might be using it without even knowing.
No, that's interesting that it's increasingly getting baked into the tools that people traditionally use, which is cool. Are there any specific thought leaders or sources that are aligned towards communication that people should look at? Perhaps to get inspiration, because you're saying that if you've got a need, find a tool to fix your need. But the old saying is like, if people wanted to go faster back at the turn of the century, they'd want a faster horse as opposed to a car. Where can people get some inspiration about tools that could expand the boundaries of what they do?
So I always enjoy listening to Shell Holtz and Neville Hobson with their podcast. There's also some really great other thought leaders out there. I also read TechCrunch
Okay.
as a publication. They tend to have, and VentureBeat has some interesting things as well. And then again, I think having worked in a SaaS company, you also need to let the things filter through a little bit. So with the latest and the shiniest, quite often there's a lot of smoke and mirrors involved. So I would definitely sit tight and just keep your ears open as to what your peers are talking about and what's working for them as well.
All right. So, proceed with caution seems to be the guidance that you're providing in this space.
Absolutely. And the talk at the moment is that there's still a lot of disappointment that people are experiencing between what they expect is possible and what they can actually do, or what is actually possible, like what the end results are at the moment. But things are changing so quickly that it's a matter of getting in there and playing with it and seeing if it will improve. So I don't think it's any different to any other tech solution, or if you're looking at an employee app, how would you go about working out what the best one was? It's the same process.
One process that you talk about in the book that is being talked about a lot at the moment is something called prompt engineering. But to what extent is this really just the same idea as asking good questions?
Well, prompt engineering is also telling it what you want. So
Okay.
being really clear. I'm teaching my boys to play with ChatGPT and create images and come up with a request, a specific request of what you want and how you refine the request, how you go in and you edit the images to to get exactly what you want, and how you keep regenerating until you're getting a much clearer response as to exactly to what you've got in your head and what you want. So the interesting thing about prompt engineering is that for us communication professionals, it's actually not too hard because we're used to working with a lot of text based. But when it comes to educating our colleagues in our organisation who might not be communication professionals and might not be used to asking good questions or being clear on their request, a lot of people are finding, say, for example, in the more accounting spaces where people are used to clicking on things to get results, that it's much harder for employees. If you click on a button to get your sum for like maybe for numbers, instead of saying please give me a sum or please summarize the columns, um, all the numbers in column A, you click on something or you open something or you hit enter. And this is where employees are needing that extra support to understand how to get the best out of different large language models, for
Well,
example,
it's
if that's the type of AI we're talking about.
you touch on the issue of language, and
Mm-hmm.
actually that seems to be a natural for communication folks because communication folks are dealing with language all the time, and so you phrase something slightly differently, and you get a slightly different response. So that doesn't strike me as surprising. I mean, I guess the issue is, one of the issues with AI is can AI do what you're doing better and faster than the way you're currently doing it?
Is that a question for me?
It's just a comment more than anything else. You did say that AI will have more impact on desk based versus frontline workers, and I found that to be an interesting statement. And I was just wondering why you would say that.
There's actually research about this, and I think it was Gartner research, and completely, I can fish it out for you, Mike, and share it with you later. But it does show that most of the impact at the moment in the next couple of years will be on those knowledge workers. That's because a lot of the physical technology and machinery that's required for that is improved with AI is lagging somewhat. There are some good examples of, say, I think it was a couple of years ago that DHL were already using drones in their warehouses to find and pick certain products. And that's a good example of effective combined use that whereas a human being would have previously done that. But if you think about, say, teachers and nurses, there are online, for example, online medical support that you can get, but people aren't willing to fully hand that over yet. And it's usually these physical roles, such as delivering. So my parcels are still delivered by a human being who comes to my door and climbs up all the flights of stairs to my apartment. And until the human being is still cheaper than having a machine or a robot climb up the stairs to deliver the parcel for me. So I guess that's what I'm trying to say. There's still that physicality that that's required at the moment.
So so
And the
basic
second,
so basically what you're saying is that in the knowledge space, there's so many different opportunities for tools, for uses of this. Um, it fits more seamlessly into desk-based knowledge work than it fits
Mhm.
into certainly physical work that's done as at what people would call the coal face. I guess what I took, as potentially a challenge to this is that because communication with frontline workers is something that people are often complaining about and citing as an issue, that maybe the improvements driven by AI at the great scheme of things may have at least as much impact as the ease of use that you find in the desk-based situation. Um, are you seeing any good uses of AI in the deskless space at the moment?
a lot of the deskless space in terms of comms is still very much focused on the employee app experience, so that's still digital. But there are some interesting examples. For example, Rewe, which is the German supermarket chain, my understanding is that they're trialing an AI agent in their warehouses, or in one of their warehouses, and it's like a person in a hologram type box. It's not technically a hologram, but it looks like a 3D person who you can talk to and ask questions, and it can respond to you, and you can ask it things like, "What's your what's my leave at the moment?" So you can ask work related questions, and this AI agent, which looks like a person in sort of like a big box, will respond to you. But it's still very much in trial stage. But for those who are interested, I have written an article on that, on published on the Halo blog.
Excellent, excellent. You talk a lot about organizational and internal networks. Where do you see internal networks becoming more relevant, more accessible, and more interesting? And I'm asking the question because this is an area of specialty for me. I've been talking about, I wrote a book about internal networks about 13 years ago. And for me, it's kind of the approach that, yes, there are a number of companies that are looking at this with any degree of seriousness, but it's still something that people see as radical and as, you know, almost even far fetched. Um, where do you see this becoming more accessible and resonant for folks?
Mike, you're always ahead of the curve. I don't. It's not radical at all. There are organisations who actively employ internal influencers. So, particularly in the IT space, there are employees. I think I'm just trying to remember which organisation it was. My apologies if it wasn't, but I do think it was Philips. Hire IT people whose role is to share and engage and interact with people in this network environment, and share their knowledge and make sure that it crosses the different silos. So this is something that's actively being embraced by organisations with an internal communications focus, and it's no different from influencer marketing that companies use externally. So working directly with influencers on social media to provide them with insights and key information. It's also very much used, particularly with adoption campaigns. So when you hear about a champion network that's being created, where the champions, or this group of people, are particularly selected and upskilled and enabled to share peer to peer with people within the organisation, and provide that context in a relevant way because they understand their peers the best. So I don't think it's radical. I hope it's not radical for people. And Mike, that you were talking about it and advocating it for it may have had something to do with the fact that so many people do use this actively as a way to engage with their people in an organization.
Fair enough. You also mentioned employer branding as an example of this principle at work. Could you say a bit more about that?
So, employer branding is about trust, it's about reputation, and what's really what's really important is that if you use it from, say, a hiring perspective, research shows that the executive network is going to be your where you get your most quality hires. So that's about the executive and leader and key employees in the organization, their contacts. And the way to reach their contacts who are potentially your best hires for your organization is through these people. It's through communicating and engaging with your executives and making sure that you're, say, whether it's you want to boost your neurodiverse population in your organization, or you want to boost your Indigenous Australian population in your organisation. There are networks there that you can tap into and work with, and their contacts. So you're reaching these people indirectly, are more likely to come and work for you. And again, this is using your employees as your advocates, and they'll probably give a more open and clear and realistic idea of working in your organization. And so when people do come on board, that they're quite comfortable with maybe your IT systems not up to speed, or maybe maybe there's some other less than ideal situation, but they will be comfortable with that and have stepped on board with that knowledge and acceptance in place already. So that's a perfect example of using employer branding, networks for employee branding.
No, that's pretty clear. I want to pick back up a concept that you mentioned in your book, because you were talking about content being king,
Mm-hmm.
and I actually wrote a piece some months ago that I don't think content's king anymore, because there's so much of it, particularly in the world of AI generated content. I think you add something to the conversation is that strategy is queen. And, particularly at a time where there's some, fairly robust conversations in the world about gender and politics, are you saying that the queen might just be a little more important than the king, particularly from a chess perspective?
They go hand in hand, Mike. The and it's not gender. I don't mind or have any opinion on gender there, but if we look specifically at chess and strategy, sort of analogy with chess, the king is typically seen as the prime piece, the piece that wins. But without a queen, or without that other component, or that ability to make those extra moves with the queen chess piece, you have a challenge where it's really, really hard to win on just a king alone. So it's really, really hard to win right now with just content alone. You need that strategy to get the results much more easily, and by working together, that's where you get the results. And I don't think you can have communication without content. You essentially, unfortunately, to communicate, you need to have something to communicate, but you need the strategy there as well to go with the content.
No, it's interesting that you said you can't. It's hard to win with only a king. I mean, and from the standpoint of chess, it's impossible to win with only a king. Physically, it's impossible. So I totally get the point that you're making. The other thing about the queen is literally the queen can pretty much take out anything on the board, and it can move anywhere on the board. And so it's a great analogy that you provide there. I wanted to touch, as we wrap up our conversation, because we talked about internal communication as you've talked about internal communication as being a leadership discipline as well as a um, tactical discipline that's executed by professionals. And you share a great story from one of our mutual friends, Davin Rosner, about the extent to which effective leadership communication can be learned. Say a bit more about that.
Dave, David is just a gem, just such a humble and warm-hearted person. And he told me this beautiful story about how he'd been working with a leader who, again, was comfortable in that one to his team environment. He was a leader that could handle the boardroom and handle his C-suite. But when it came to being in front of that one to many, he really was really uncomfortable and insisted on having slides that were really dense and text heavy with lots of numbers. And going right back to one of those points that we said earlier, Mike, to get any results, you do need to get some wins on the board. And Darwin provided his advice and to cut back. But the leader really held on to this idea of ploughing through with these dense slides, and everybody's eyes just glazed over. And then this leader realized that it hadn't gone well and sought out Davin's help. And together they worked on really coming to the core and the essence of what the leader wanted to share, and went that storytelling approach. And so the next time that this particular CEO stood up and needed to present and share, they focused on what it meant to them having the support of their employees around them and what the employees had achieved. And the results were captivating. He had his audience. Nobody was worried about the slides. And it was such a success moment where, through working with the leader, sort of understood that he had missed an opportunity the first time round, and then working with Darwin on a better approach, got to see for himself the results that more effective communication can bring with an audience at scale. And this is what we need to be doing as much as we can within our organisation and with our leaders, is helping them become better communicators.
So how do we get their attention? How do we get them to take this seriously enough, A, for them to make a greater difference, but also for us to make a greater difference to them?
It comes down to understanding your leader's motivation. It comes down to stakeholder management 101 in terms of listening and understanding what they want to achieve and helping them achieve their goals, and then they will see the value in what you're doing. And as communicators, we have so much to offer. And again, as I said, I think our job right now is to really focus on using those skills of persuasion and influence to the good of not only our profession, but to the good of our people in the organisation, because they will get leaders who are better communicators, and also to the benefit of our leaders who can really upskill, step up, and help our people through the change that they're going through right now and is coming faster than ever.
So the change is coming faster than ever. Any advice that you have to, as we wrap up this conversation, any additional advice that you have on navigating the wave of change, the multiple changes, and the challenges that those changes bring?
I'll give you 3.
3 is good.
Number 1, don't sit on your hands.
Okay.
It's time that we get on with what we need to do. We need to be beyond play to productive when it comes to AI and technology. And
Okay.
that's number
That's
one.
number one.
Number two is making sure that we're upskilling and focusing on knowing what great communication looks like. We have the skills as communicators as we step into this future that's moving faster and faster. We know what good looks like. And we spoke already a little bit about best practice, but when I talk about best practice again, I mean those principles. We know what good looks like. So let's take assurance in that, and let's not get sidetracked by the shiny new toy.
Okay.
And number three is making sure that we upskill our leaders, that we help them be the best communicators that they can be, because leadership communication plays such a crucial role in anchoring and supporting our people through change. So that's our challenge, and that's what we need to do, Mike.
Anything else you want to add?
Don't feel overwhelmed. We're all in the same boat, and if we share our knowledge and experience, just as you are doing, Mike, every day we will get ourselves into a much better, higher value position and make sure that we're not the button pushers, but rather the strategic partners.
Got it. Want to thank you very much, Monique, for your wisdom and your insights today. This is the Changing the Terms podcast, the Communication Disruptors, and I'm your host,